I will speak to you a little bit from the perspective of a social psychologist, but one who's been involved in government and government studies for some time, about the issue of trust, which I understand is something that's engaging our attention here. Let me start by saying that one of the relatively few things about being more senior is that you get to observe trends as they get to have observed trends as they occur. And one trend which is much on my mind in the context of our conference here is this. About 40 years ago, I began working for the US government. This was during the Carter administration, though I worked for the judicial branch. And one of the things that has struck me looking over the period since then till now is how much better we have gotten with sort of the technology of government. And I don't mean electronic technology necessarily, but how much better we have gotten at governing in so many places. The minister's presentation this morning reminded me of how much more sophisticated we can be about looking at the impact of our policies and the terrain that we're working with as we structure and execute government. At the same time, though, there's this disturbing trend. These are OECD data. I could show something similar for Australia, for example. There's this disturbing trend of people trust us less. That trust in national government has been decreasing. This is over a 5-year period, but if you looked at long-term trends, they've been down in many countries over the last several decades. Disturbing also is the fact that it's the national government that's taking the biggest hit, so to speak. Why don't people trust their national governments the way they used to? As a psychologist, I'm sort of engaged in this sort of a disconnect and thinking about, well, why should this happen? What's going on in these people's minds? So what I'd like to do is to start with a couple of brief narratives to sort of frame the issue, which I'm not going to be coy about. My issue is, what is the experience of government like for most people? What is the experience of their national government like? Let's put aside ideology and just talk about personal experience. And I want to frame the discussion in terms of two personal experiences of mine, and this will be tales about the American government, but I invite you to think whether the same sort of thing might happen in Australia or New Zealand. One experience is taking my son to get a passport. His passport had expired, and he was coming up for a semester abroad in New Zealand, as it happens, and needed an American passport to travel there. The other experience is purchasing an iPad from an Apple store. And I want to contrast these two narratives to give you an idea of what's going on psychologically in the experience of government. Let me start with the iPad experience. Decided I needed a new iPad. So I went to my local Apple store, a bright, sunny, open store, glass in the front, welcoming you in with all sorts of pictures of what you might purchase there. You walk into an Apple store, at least in Durham, North Carolina, and probably here too. In Durham, North Carolina, you're immediately greeted by someone wearing an Apple shirt, most likely a highly tattooed and pierced young person who nonetheless is quite knowledgeable about Apple devices and is also quite highly trained in how to interact with you. Apple store employees are taught how to greet people, how to pass a customer off from one person to another. So I go in, immediately someone comes up, hello, I'm Daniel, welcome to the Apple store, why are you here, how can I help you? I'm looking for an iPad. Oh, Mark over here is our iPad person, and I'll tell him right away he's with another customer, but why don't you sit down at this table where incidentally you can play with other Apple devices that you might like to purchase. And sure enough, Mark comes over and talks to you about what you need, how are you going to use your iPad, here are the options available for you, what sort of services do you want. Walk out with an iPad, quite happy, and with a feeling that it was a positive experience. It was that I know, I'm a business school professor, I know Apple does not have an intense desire to to like me, but they do have a desire to have a relationship with me, and they want me to feel good about my experience with respect to the company. And they've executed quite well on that. They've decided how to make that happen. Now, my son Pippin and I go to get his passport. We go to our local post office. It's a nice looking place, not quite as fancy as the Apple store, but quite pleasant. Unfortunately, when you go in and go to the passport office, you see this sign, and the writing's kind of small, so I'll tell you, it says, passport application must be completed before, underlined in red, the appointment time, and in black ink only. And then underneath there's a sign that says, by appointment only. At the very bottom, knock twice. The implication is, if you don't have appointment, we don't want to see you. And knock twice because we're not going to be paying much attention to your needs. You'd better make them very well known. We proceeded in where actually a postal service employee about the same age as those Apple employees helped us. She wasn't particularly friendly. She was getting the forms filled out and executing the task quite competently, but without any real personal engagement. And when I first started talking about this, it occurred to me that this is the essence, I think, of some of the problems that government has in terms of building trust. The personal experience of government. And notice, for Pippin and me, this is one of very few personal interactions we have with our national government. Okay? I pay my taxes online. My accountant figures them up and tells me how much to write the check for, or better still, withdraws it straight from my bank account. But my personal experience of the U.S. government is this sort of thing. Now, why does the Department of State of the United States government treat us like this? I think the reason is that while Apple wants us to come back and buy more Apple devices and maintain a relationship with Apple, the Department of State thinks, what are you going to do? You're an American. Where are you going to get a passport if not from us, right? We have, in essence, a monopoly here. And you see this kind of behavior, at least in the States, in a number of kind of monopolistic organizations. I could tell you long stories about my interaction with my cable company. But the problem is, what I think the United States State Department doesn't understand or hasn't thought through here is, yes, I do have another choice. I can trust you less. I can withdraw. In organizational studies, we talk about organizational withdrawal as a response to bad treatment or feelings of unfair treatment, meaning you don't leave because you don't have another job offer, you don't have another opportunity. You just withdraw. You spend less and less time working less and less diligently. And to me, just the personal experience here is not unlike this, the organizational withdrawal literature. Let me shift a little bit and go from narrative of personal experiences to science. Stick with me, because I'm not going to go real deep into this, but I do think it's interesting to see. This is human brain, and often when I give this talk, I say most of your constituents have one of these. I'll say to you, this is the organ through which government works. Okay, this is how government functions, is through the human brain. The brain has, humans especially, have a section of their brain up here at the front, really quite remarkable. It's what we do maths in. It's how we resolve logic problems. It's what makes economics work. But humans also have a substantial portion of their brain. This isn't showing up very well, but further back here, evolved earlier, but just as powerful, that deals with social relationships. That's all about how am I being treated, and how can I judge how I should respond to people. There's some fascinating research done by Eisenberger, Lieberman, and Williams, published in the journal Science. Eisenberger et al. Took some college sophomores and induced them to lie in fMRI machines, which are brain scan machines, that record what part of the brain is activated when a certain depending on the stimulus, on what's happening to the person as they're in the fMRI. They expose them to this little game which is called cyberball. Imagine you're controlling a paddle that controls that hand at the bottom of the screen and that decides who to throw the ball to. And the participants are told, we just want to see what happens as you play this little game while you're in the brain scan machine. After a little bit of the game proceeding much like this, though, it begins to proceed like this. You don't get the ball ever again. And the reason that Eisenberg et al. Did this was they wanted to see what the human brain does when you're excluded, when you feel excluded, when you're no longer part of the game. What happens, you don't need to know brain anatomy for this, what happens is a very particular part of the brain lights up. This is the exclusion reaction. For those who are into this, it's called the anterior cingulate cortex. Blood starts flowing to that part of the brain. Interesting if you're a neuroscientist, but if you're a psychologist, or if you're engaged in governance, the interesting thing really is that previous studies had showed that exact same part of the brain is what lights up when you ask subjects in an fMRI machine to stick their fingers into scalding water. Okay? It's the pain center. It's the part of the brain that tells us we're hurt. Eisenberg, Lieberman, and Williams argue, well, that's just the way that we evolved. There was a time when being excluded meant you didn't live very long. And so you had to register quite a strong reaction to feeling excluded. And as we evolved, the brain said, hey, I already have a way to register things we're not supposed to do. It's the pain center. So I'll just use that. The point I want to make is that it's there. We can't not feel pain when we're excluded. It's not that pain feels like it hurts. I mean, it's not that exclusion feels like it hurts, feels pain. It's that exclusion is pain. It's precisely the same part of the brain is being activated. Okay, that's all the brain science that you have to put up with for right now. The point I want to make is that the human brain registers exclusion, and the challenge for us in terms of government is how do we make people feel less excluded? How can we tell when they're feeling excluded from the experience of government? Go back to those graphs I presented at the very beginning. Why are these trust numbers going down? And my argument would be that people are feeling excluded. People are feeling less and less involved in their government. Now, there's the answer, and I had political science the same as everybody else. There's the answer, well, you get to vote, right? You're included in these governments because you get to vote, which is true. But notice that, for example, in the last election, my vote was 164 millionth of the decision-making power in that election. Okay? Even so, knowing that I can vote is one of these forebrain sort of cognitions, these forebrain sort of logically I can vote, and I understand if enough people like me vote in a particular way, we'll change our government. But it's not this social brain kind of experience. The social brain experience recently is that passport office. So the challenge for us, I think, is to think how can we build a greater feeling of inclusion, a greater feeling of involvement with our government, or the national government, or other government agencies. Now, my particular area of expertise, what I've studied over the years, is an attitude, a belief structure called procedural justice. Do I believe that the process is fair? It turns out that the things that drive feelings of procedural justice are largely involved with inclusion. They're largely involved with how can I find some indication that I am part of the process, that I am part of the team, part of the group. These graphs are taken from some work I did recently, looking first at the link between things associated with inclusion, and I'll elaborate these in just a moment. But they're things like, am I treated with respect? Am I Am I listened to? Do I receive explanations? The sort of things that I experienced when I walked into the Apple store, but not when I walked into the passport office. So those types of inclusion make people say it's fair. I've been fairly treated. And that fair treatment reaction turns out to be one of the strongest predictors of trust. So my work of my colleague Tom Tyler over a number of years, and a lot of scholars have documented this link between feeling fairly treated and trust. I was just speaking to Nicole and saying that it seems to me that people use this walk away feeling fairly treated as almost like a thermometer, almost like an indicator that I'm okay. It's okay, I'm part of this process and I can relax into it in a sense. Procedural fairness treatments, this slide is mainly to say what they're not. So procedural fairness and procedural justice judgments are not just judgments about abstract fairness, okay? They tend to be judgments about personal experience. So do I believe that the distribution of welfare benefits in my nation are fair? That's an abstract fairness judgment. Do I believe that the distribution of incomes in my nation is fair? That would be an abstract justice judgment. Do I believe that I am treated fairly by my employer or by my state government or by my national government? Those are procedural fairness judgments. And they tend to certainly be influenced by the outcomes I receive, but they're influenced also by the process. So another bullet here. They're not just satisfaction, right? It's not just a question of satisfaction. Am I satisfied? Because satisfied often has this strong kind of outcome component to it. And satisfaction does matter, but it doesn't matter as much for trust as it turns out as procedural justice judgments do. Okay, let's put the brain aside. The brain is explaining to us why this happens, but what do we see practically if we do these inclusion sorts of things that give rise to the feeling of being fairly treated? And my argument basically is there are three reasons to do it. I'll show you, if time allows, some quick data on this. First, it builds trust in government. It increases your perception of the legitimacy of the government. Why do these people have the right to tell me what to do? Why do they have the right to regulate my affairs? It increases the acceptance and compliance with regulations and decisions. So a lot of my early work, actually the work that I did when I worked for the US government, was around how can you get people to accept a judicial judgment rather than appealing it, or to accept it rather than simply not complying with it. And the answer we found was strongly tied to this judgment of fair process. If people thought the process was fair, okay, I lost, but I lost fairly, and I'll go along with the decision. And then finally, I'll come back to brain science at the very end to say that just as exclusion has been shown to prompt pain reactions in the brain, fair treatment has been shown to prompt pleasure reactions in the brain. The feeling of being fairly treated gives you a warm glow, gives you a feeling that you're part of the process, and that's a pleasant thing. I'm going to run just through some very quick data, actually a good bit of it coming from Australia. These are some data from a study that Tyler and others did here in Canberra, looking at an alternative process for dealing with I think habitual drunk driving, and structuring the process either along traditional lines or structuring the process so that it included these elements of what we call voice, respect and dignity, and explanations. So the blue bars here are the procedural justice version. The orange bars are the conventional process. What they saw was an increase in perceived fairness on the part of both the defendant and the defendant's families, I think, when the procedural fairness, procedural justice intervention was done, but a corresponding increase in belief in the legitimacy of the drunk driving laws. So this is one of the reasons we do this. Can we make people more accepting of government legitimacy and more trusting in government? Reason 2, compliance and acceptance. This is the sort of thing I've done a fair amount. The data on the left is from that from work that I did looking at judicial decisions, hearing officers' decisions, as a function of whether the hearing process was seen as fair or not. And you can see a substantial increase in acceptance rates for the fair process relative to the unfair process. Kelly C., one of my students, looked at reactions to new environmental regulations that were promulgated in our state government. And that's just the warning bell. I have a few seconds left. Environmental regulations that regulated pollution in our rivers, so regulating the effluent that cities could release and the fertilizers that farmers could use, and looking at compliance with those rules as a function of whether the pre-regulatory process, the hearing process prior to the promulgation of the regulations was seen as fair. So treat them fairly so that they will go along, so that they will obey. And then finally, and again, I'm not going to go into brain data here, but this is the finding that the researchers labeled the sunny side of fairness. The idea that if you treat someone fairly, it lights up a part of the brain, which quite interestingly, is also lit up when you receive chocolate, when you give the participants chocolate. They had a great line in this article about fairness is like chocolate, which I loved. Okay, how do you do procedural fairness? I'll just reiterate this and talk a little bit about how it happens, and invite you to think in your own experience of government, not as a government official, but as a citizen. How often do you run across these things? There's a phenomenon we've looked at for many years called voice. The idea being I'm listened to. They don't have to go along with me, but they need to listen to me. Again, it reminded me of something the minister said earlier today. I understand you're the government. I understand you don't do everything I want, and I understand that in any social structure, I don't always get my way. What really bothers me is when I'm not listened to. What really bothers me is when I'm not even worth hearing. So this is a very powerful determinant of perceived fairness. A key element here is I have to think somebody's considering what I have to say. The U.S. regulatory agencies have a website called regulation.gov, I think, and you can put comments in on any regulation that the U.S. government, federal government, is considering. The problem is they just go in. You know, you never know where they go. You never know if anyone actually reads them. So consideration matters. Respect and dignity is a big deal. The way I was treated when I went in the Apple store was, "We're glad to see you. You know what you want, and you tell us what you want, and we try to work things out, given Apple devices the best we can." The experience in the passport office was the opposite. You're just another form. You're just another set of forms that I need to process. And then finally, again to a point that the minister raised earlier, explanations matter. How can I participate? How can I be engaged with government if I don't understand what's happening? Looking back on my own government service, I think one of the things that I didn't realize was how alien any given government interaction is to the average citizen. You know, the young lady in the passport office does passports all day long. She knows how they work. She knows why they have to be in black ink. But she never told us that. And so it's difficult for us to understand why we're being told to do these things. We don't feel like we're included in the process. And these data are again from an Australian study. This is a study of random breath testing for drunk driving in Queensland. What the experimenters and the local police did was to figure out a script for interactions when a random drunk driving stop occurred that included these elements. What do What do you, driver that I stopped, think should be done about drunk driving? Let me hear that. How can I show you that I respect you? Part of the script was for the officer to squat down so that they're looking eye to eye with the motorist rather than looking down at them. And finally, why did I stop you? Why am I doing this? It wasn't your driving, it's just that your number came up, and this is the way this procedure worked. The bar on the left is the experimental interaction between the officer and the driver. The one on the right is the conventional one, and you can see these interactions were increasing perceived fairness. Now I'll move very quickly to to closing this and say just a couple of things. As I've been thinking about this and starting to do some research on it, it occurs to me that decrease in trust, while it can have many, okay, I'm out of time, can have many sources, is in part because we do not have human interactions very often with our government. They're so tightly scripted, I can't get the data to say I'm fairly treated. And one of the challenges that I put in front of you and put in front of officials of my government is how can you, with each interaction that a citizen has with government, ratchet that up a little bit and increase that trust somewhat. It'll involve training, it'll involve monitoring, but I think the basic science is there and the challenge is to execute it. I'll stop there.